In 1948, a mechanic from Michigan built a car so far ahead of its time that Detroit's biggest manufacturers didn't know whether to mock it or panic. It had a padded dashboard, so your head wouldn't split open in a crash. Seatbelts, at a time when almost no production car had them. A windshield designed to pop clean out of its frame on impact instead of shattering into your face. And a third headlight mounted in the center of the grille that turned with the steering wheel, so it lit up the road around a corner before your car even got there. Then, before a single one of these cars could reach a real showroom, the man who built it was dragged into a federal fraud trial that tore his company apart from the inside. Only 51 of these cars were ever finished. And more than 75 years later, people are still arguing about whether Preston Tucker was a con man who got exactly what he deserved, or the one man Detroit could not afford to let succeed. To understand how it got to that point, you have to go back to a man who spent most of his life around machines that other people thought were impossible. Preston Tucker grew up obsessed with cars and speed, working his way through jobs as a police officer, a car salesman, and, eventually, a race team manager at the Indianapolis 500. During the Second World War, he ran a small company that designed a rotating gun turret for combat aircraft and armored vehicles, along with a fast, lightweight combat car for the Army. The Army turned down the combat car for being too fast for its own troops to control safely. But the turret design got picked up and used on real aircraft, and it proved something important. Tucker wasn't just a car guy chasing a dream. He understood how to engineer something from scratch, get it approved by skeptical government inspectors, and put it into actual production. When the war ended, Tucker saw an opening nobody else in Detroit wanted to touch. The big three automakers, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, had not released a genuinely new car design in years because all their factories had been converted to build tanks, jeeps, and bombers. Once peace came, they simply dusted off their pre-war blueprints and kept selling the same basic cars with a fresh coat of paint. Tucker's bet was that American drivers, who had just spent years building the machines that won a world war, would not settle for warmed-over 1941 sedans. He announced his new company in 1946 with a car he called the Tucker Torpedo, and he did not just promise something new. He promised something that made every other car on the road look outdated and unsafe by comparison. The car that came out of that promise, eventually renamed the Tucker 48, read less like a used car lot and more like a list of features that would not become industry standard for another 20 to 30 years. The engine sat in the rear, a massive aluminum flat six that Tucker's engineers adapted from a helicopter engine design, chosen specifically because it was lighter and more powerful than anything Detroit was running. The frame was built around what Tucker called a crash chamber, a reinforced footwell under the dashboard where passengers could dive down and brace themselves before impact. Disc brakes, which most American manufacturers would not adopt for another 2 decades, came standard. And that center headlight was not a gimmick. It was wired directly to the steering system so that any turn past a certain angle swung the light with it, cutting through the exact kind of blind curve that caused nighttime accidents. Detroit had spent years treating safety as an afterthought you paid extra for. Tucker built an entire car around the idea that safety was the whole point. Here's the part that made this personal for the men running the auto industry. Tucker didn't just have a concept car. He had a real factory. An enormous former aircraft plant in Chicago that had built B-29 bomber engines during the war, and he raised the money to lease it by selling dealer franchises and stock directly to the public. Tens of thousands of ordinary Americans who wanted in on what looked like the next Ford or Chevrolet. By the summer of 1947, Tucker had a working prototype, a factory, a dealer network signing up across the country, and a growing wave of national press coverage. For the first time since before the war, someone outside Detroit's own walls looked like a real threat to the Big Three's grip on the American car market. And that is exactly the moment things started to turn. Now, hold that thought, because the reckoning that came for Preston Tucker over the next 2 years is going to look less like a business failure and more like a demolition job. And by the end of this video, you'll see exactly which of his impossible safety ideas Detroit was forced to quietly steal decades later. The first cracks came from an unlikely source, a nationally syndicated radio commentator named Drew Pearson, whose broadcast reached tens of millions of Americans every week. In June of 1947, before a single production Tucker had even rolled off the line, Pearson went on air and told his audience that the Tucker car was a fraud, that it would never actually be built, and that people who had invested their savings in it were being swindled. The claim was built on thin evidence, but Pearson's audience was enormous, and the story spread fast. Around the same time, the Securities and Exchange Commission opened an informal inquiry into how Tucker was raising money, focused specifically on the dealer franchise sales that were funding his factory lease and tooling costs. This is where the story stops looking like ordinary bad luck. The SEC's investigation was pushed hard by a Michigan senator named Homer Ferguson, whose home state economy ran almost entirely on the profits of Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, and who had close, well-documented ties to Detroit's auto establishment. Meanwhile, Tucker's own factory lease with the Federal War Assets Administration, the very Chicago plant he needed to build cars at scale, came under renewed government scrutiny at the exact moment his production numbers needed to start climbing. Journalists who had spent 1946 writing glowing profiles of the boy genius engineer suddenly needed to write suspicion into every paragraph because the story had shifted, and skepticism sold better than admiration. By early 1948, the SEC had escalated its informal inquiry into a formal investigation. Federal agents were combing through Tucker's financial records, and the negative headlines had become a daily drumbeat that made new dealer sign-ups and stock purchases dry up almost overnight. A company that runs on public investment cannot survive a sustained campaign convincing the public it is a scam, whether or not the scam is real. In June of 1949, a federal grand jury indicted Preston Tucker and 7 of his executives on charges of mail fraud, conspiracy, and violating securities regulations, accusing them of selling stock and dealer franchises based on promises they allegedly never intended to keep. By this point, the company had already collapsed under the financial pressure of the investigation itself. The factory had gone quiet, and every dealer who had bought in was left holding nothing. The trial ran through the fall of 1949, and prosecutors spent weeks presenting their case to a jury. Tucker's own defense turned the courtroom into an inversion of the government's narrative. His lawyers walked the jury through the actual engineering, brought in real production cars that ran and drove exactly as promised, and argued that the only thing Preston Tucker was actually guilty of was moving too fast for people who could not stomach the idea of him succeeding. On January 22, 1950, the jury returned its verdict. Preston Tucker and every one of his co-defendants were acquitted on every single count. There was no fraud. The engineering was real, the cars ran, and the money had gone almost entirely into tooling, factory equipment, and production costs, exactly where Tucker said it would go. But acquittal does not reopen a shuttered factory. By the time the verdict came down, the Tucker Corporation had been dead for months, its assets already being liquidated to cover debts, its dealer network scattered, its once enormous Chicago plant sitting empty. Winning in court meant nothing for a business that had already been strangled outside of it. In total, only 51 Tucker 48s were ever completed before production stopped for good, each one now worth more than most people's houses, not because the car was rare by design, but because it was murdered in its crib. Here's where that thread I asked you to hold on to finally pays off. Almost everything that made the Tucker 48 look like a paranoid overreaction in 1948 became federal law or standard equipment within a few decades. Seatbelts, which Tucker installed voluntarily while most manufacturers treated them as an unnecessary expense, became mandatory equipment in every new American car by the late 1960s. The padded dashboard concept Tucker championed became a legal requirement shortly after. Safety glass windshields designed to fail in a way that protects occupants, the direct descendant of Tucker's pop-out design, became standard across the entire industry. And that steering-linked center headlight that critics mocked as science fiction gimmickry reappeared decades later as adaptive headlight technology, now sold as a premium safety feature on cars from Mercedes to Lexus to Audi, marketed with the exact same pitch Tucker used in 1948. It lights up the corner before you get there. The Tucker 48 never got the chance to prove itself on the open market, and that's exactly why the debate around it refuses to die. Automotive historians remain split. Some argue Tucker's finances really were reckless enough to justify federal scrutiny, and that his acquittal proved he broke no laws, not that he ran a clean business. Others point to the timing, the political pressure from a senator tied directly to Detroit's interests, the aggressive press campaign that started before a single car existed, and the collapse of the company months before a jury ever cleared his name, and see something closer to an execution than an investigation. What almost nobody disputes is the engineering itself. Preston Tucker built a car in 1948 that predicted where the entire auto industry would be forced to go by the 1980s. And the only thing that stopped him from getting there first was everyone who had the most to lose if he did. 51 cars, one trial, one acquittal that came 30 years too late to matter. Share your thoughts below.